startups could add $1 trillion to the economy by FY30 and create 50 million new jobs, according to CII's latest report titled Unicorn 2.0, adding the next trillion. It says that India minted more than 100 unicorns between 2010 and 23, and another 300 could be created between now and 2035. So joining me now to discuss more highlights about this report is Rahul Garg, the co-chairman of CII's Unicorn Forum and the founder and CEO of Moglix. Rahul, thanks very much for your time here on CNBC-TV18. The theme of the report is startups adding $1 trillion. So if you could start by telling us, what are the key factors that will drive this kind of contribution by 2030?
No, firstly, I would want to highlight that I think startups' contribution to the GDP has been pretty significant. When we started the report, we didn't realize the fact that startups are contributing almost 10 to 15% of the GDP growth in the country already, and with 100 plus unicorns and 100,000 plus startups in the country. Now, if you look at on a sector by sector basis, you see every single sector, the contribution is going to multiply. I mean, there are some sectors like consumer commerce. They are continuing to grow to maybe 6 to 7x of the current size. But then you have a newer and growing sectors like B2B and manufacturing, where this contribution is going to just skyrocket over the next 10 years, right? And I think the number of jobs that are created by startups is again growing at the rapid rate, contributing to this $1 trillion vision that we have set for the startups. And I think maybe we'll overshoot. I think startups are used to under committing and over delivering. So I wouldn't be surprised if we overshoot the target.
Well, I wouldn't say that they're under committing at the moment, but some of these sectors you said are going to have a disproportionate contribution to the growth. What are some of the orbital shifts that will define this next phase of growth that you were talking about?
So I think the key is that there is technology which is under-penetrated in many of the sectors, and those sectors are growing rapidly. I mean, manufacturing is one of them that I am very closely associated with. And you see that unlike B2C commerce, which started kind of in 2012, 2013, we have seen B2B commerce starting only in 2018, 2019. So there is almost a lag of technology adoption in some of these sectors. Again, if you take the exports as a market, now, exports is still very early, but with the dynamics that we see with China Plus One, the exports are going to grow phenomenally over the next few years. And the third, I think consumer commerce is starting to become a reality and therefore growing organically at a much faster pace.
Okay, you spoke about the tech and the tech-related sectors growing fast, but by FY30, if we are to create 50 million more jobs for the startup ecosystem, only 5% of these are direct jobs. We also want to understand whether finding the right talent is going to remain a challenge. What does your report say?
No, I think skilling gap is real. I think we need more and more skilled talent. I think one of the interesting things we found was that many of the startups, actually, if you take Urban Company as example, I mean, they are training gig workers pretty much from scratch. I mean, there are education startups which are training people from the scratch, right? So there are many of the startups who have been putting efforts to train people either on the supply side or demand side. I mean, drivers have been trained. How do they behave and how do they sort of behave with the customers, so on and so forth. So I think there is a lot of skilling effort done by the startups. We also believe that as an ecosystem, we can come together and do a better job of scaling, particularly the blue collar jobs in terms of skilling, and also look at government in terms of what can we do together with the government to fulfill this skilling gap.
What are the big regulatory themes you expect to play out over the course of the next decade or so? More companies reverse flipping, for instance?
So definitely, I think the Indian stock market is starting to become significant in the world. I mean, we will. There is no reason we'll become the third largest and stock market in the world. Therefore, it makes sense for companies to list in the market where the brand is well known. Take Istas, for example. I mean, like Zomato is a well-known brand in India, or Paytm or Policy Bazaar. All these are well-known brands in India, and therefore the retail investors, the institutional domestic investors, understand these brands much better in India. So therefore, it makes sense to list in India. And therefore, I would think most companies which have India as the dominant consumer or a business market would want to list in India, and the reverse flipping is bound to happen.
A final question, Rahul, before we let you go, what about the funding landscape? We often hear founders allude to the fact that there is lack of patient capital. Banks don't really fund startups. How is this pool of capital going to evolve?
No, so I think there is an increasing recognition, firstly from the government. I think the 10,000 crore they committed, that was like, today, if you look at it, there are many more domestic funds versus what existed 10 years back. We also see government coming up with commitments for kind of deep tech startups. I think we have heard numbers like 1 lakh crore, and Startup Mahakumbh is also around the corner. I think we are continuing to see that there is a seeding by the government. And then there are more and more of the institutional as well as family offices and domestic continuing to contribute more towards the startup funding versus what they had done in past.
Rahul, pleasure speaking with you, and thank you very much for sharing those important highlights with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
On that note, it is time for us to head into a short